The silence of the Wyoming Territory was a living thing. It had a weight and a texture, and for Jacob Stone, it was the sound of everything he had lost. It filled the corners of the small cabin he had built with his own hands, clung to the rough-hewn timbers of the roof, and settled over the empty chair across the hearth like a shroud. He was a man in his late 30s, but the emptiness had carved years onto his face, etching deep lines around his eyes and mouth that had nothing to do with the sun or the wind. His days were a ritual of hard labor, a rhythm he imposed on the vast, unforgiving land to keep the ghosts at bay. Before the sun had even thought of breaching the horizon, he was up, the cold floorboards biting at the soles of his feet. He would move with a deliberate, joyless efficiency, stoking the fire, putting the coffee on to boil, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted motion. He ate his breakfast of hardtack and bacon standing by the stove, staring out the single window at the endless sea of sage and prairie grass that was his world. The ranch was his inheritance and his prison. It stretched for miles in every direction, a sprawling, lonely kingdom of dust and sky. The land itself was a study in savage beauty. In the summer, the sun beat down with a merciless intensity, baking the ground into a cracked, pale canvas and choking the air with a fine grit that got into a man's teeth and soul. In the winter, the wind came screaming down from the north, a raw, physical force that drove snow into impassable drifts and could freeze a stray steer solid in a matter of hours. The sky was immense, a crushing dome of blue or gray that seemed to press down on the earth, reminding a man of his own insignificance. Yet, there were moments of grace, a sunset that set the distant mountains ablaze with colors no painter could dream of, or the profound stillness of a starlit night when the heavens felt close enough to touch. But beauty did not pay the bills, and it did not fill the silence. The ranch was failing. The fences, which he spent most of his days mending, seemed to break faster than he could fix them. His herd was thinning, the cattle lean from a summer of poor grazing. The cholera that had swept through the territory 5 years prior had taken his wife, Sarah, and their 4-year-old son, Thomas. It had happened so fast. 1 week, the cabin was filled with Sarah's quiet humming and Thomas's shrieks of laughter. The next, there was only the wind whistling through the eaves. He had buried them himself on the small rise behind the cabin, marking their graves with simple wooden crosses he had carved with numb fingers. He had worked the ranch alone ever since, throwing himself into the labor as if he could physically exhaust the grief from his body. But grief was not like a muscle. It did not tire. It was a patient, persistent companion, and in the deafening quiet of the evenings, it spoke the loudest. One night, the loneliness was more than he could bear. He sat at the small wooden table, the light from the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The plate from his meager supper of beans sat before him, cold and forgotten. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of work. They were strong hands, capable of building a home and taming a wild land, but they were useless against the ache in his chest. A profound sense of failure washed over him, colder and sharper than any winter wind. He was failing the ranch. He was failing the memory of his family. He was a man adrift in an ocean of silence, and he was drowning. It was then that he remembered a conversation with another rancher, a man named Henderson, down at the general store in Redemption a month back. Henderson had been talking about his cousin, who had found a wife through a matronly gazette, a mail-order bride from back east. Jacob had scoffed at the time, the idea seeming desperate and unnatural. A man took a wife he knew, a woman from his own world. But his world was now a party of one. The idea, once so distasteful, now returned to him, a small, desperate flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. With a heavy sigh, he rose and walked to the small chest at the foot of his bed. Buried beneath some old shirts was a copy of the matrimonial messenger that Henderson had pressed on him. He pulled it out, the cheap paper feeling flimsy and shameful in his hands. He sat back down at the table and opened it. The pages were filled with advertisements from women seeking husbands in the West, their words a chorus of hope and longing. There were also notices from men, like him, seeking a partner. Wyoming rancher, 38 years of age, widower, no children living, seeks a plain and honest woman of good character for the purpose of matrimony. Must be willing to work hard and endure the hardships of frontier life. I own 640 acres of land and a modest herd. Am a man of simple habits and few words. A photograph is not required, but a truthful letter is. He read the words over and over. Each one was a confession of his own defeat. To have to advertise for a wife felt like announcing to the world that he was not man enough to find one on his own, that the life he had built was so bleak that no woman would choose it freely. But the alternative was to let the silence swallow him whole. With a grim set of his jaw, he took out a pen and paper and painstakingly copied the advertisement, changing the details to fit his own. He would send it off with the supply wagon tomorrow. It was a shot in the dark, a final, desperate gamble against the encroaching emptiness. Hundreds of miles to the east, in a crowded, clamorous city in Ohio, Elara Vance lived in a silence of her own. It was not the silence of empty spaces, but the silence of a life unlived, of words unsaid, of a spirit confined. From her earliest memory, she had been different. She had grown not just up, but out, her limbs lengthening at a rate that defied nature and propriety. By the age of 16, she was taller than every man in her town, and she had not stopped growing. Now, in her late 20s, she stood nearly 7 feet tall, a human monument in a world built to a smaller scale. Her height was the defining fact of her existence. It was the first thing people saw, and, for most, it was the only thing. In the streets, she was a spectacle. Men stared with a mixture of shock and crude curiosity. Women whispered behind their hands, their eyes filled with a pity that felt sharper than any insult. Children would sometimes point and shout, their innocent cruelty a constant reminder of her otherness. To escape the stares, she had learned to live a shuttered existence. She spent most of her days indoors, in the small, cramped house she shared with her parents and 2 younger, perfectly proportioned sisters. Her family treated her with a kind of weary resignation, as if she were a piece of oversized furniture they did not know where to put. They loved her, she supposed, in their own way. But she was a burden, an embarrassment. Her sisters were married, with homes and children of their own. Elara was simply Elara, the unmarried, towering daughter who stayed in her room and read books. Her room was her only sanctuary, a small attic space where she could be herself, surrounded by the world she found in novels. But even there, she could not escape the low ceilings that forced her to stoop, or the bed that was too short for her long frame. Every corner of her world was a reminder that she did not fit. She longed for space, for a horizon that was not blocked by another building, for a place where her size might be an asset, or, at the very least, an irrelevance. She dreamed of a life of purpose, of being a partner to someone, not just a problem to be managed. It was a foolish, childish dream. She knew. What man would want a wife who loomed over him like a giantess from a fairy tale? One afternoon, her father brought home a parcel from the market wrapped in an old newspaper. As she unwrapped the salted fish, her eyes fell upon a column of small advertisements. The Matrimonial Messenger. Her heart gave a strange, painful lurch. She read through the notices, her initial curiosity turning into a desperate, fragile hope. Then she saw it. A notice from a man in a place called Wyoming. His words were simple, direct, and unadorned. He spoke of hardship, of hard work, of a life of few words. He did not ask for a photograph. He asked for a truthful letter. Something in the plain honesty of his advertisement resonated with a deep chord inside her. Wyoming. The name itself sounded vast and empty, a place with enough room for a person to breathe. This was it. A chance. Perhaps her very last one. to escape the suffocating cage of her life. Her hands trembled as she sat down to write her reply. What could she say? How could she describe herself without mentioning the one, all-consuming fact of her appearance? She decided she would not lie, but she would omit. She would present the person she was on the inside, the woman who lived behind the wall of her height. She wrote of her love for books, but also of her strength and her willingness to work. She wrote of her understanding that life was not easy, and that she did not shrink from a challenge. She poured all of her intelligence, her gentle humor, and her profound, aching loneliness onto the page. She wrote of her desire for a home, not just a house, and for a partner to stand with against the world. She signed it, sealed it, and sent it off with a prayer that felt as large and as hopeless as the sky. To her astonishment, he wrote back. Jacob Stone's letters were much like his advertisement, brief, practical, and to the point. He wrote of his cattle, of the coming winter, of the need to repair the roof of his barn. Yet, between the sparse lines, Elara could sense a deep decency, a bedrock of character that his loneliness had not eroded. She answered his letters with descriptions of the changing seasons in Ohio, of a passage from a book she'd read, of her thoughts on what made a home. A correspondence developed, a fragile bridge of words built across a continent between two isolated souls. For Jacob, Elara's letters were like a spring rain on a parched land. He had not realized how thirsty he was for conversation, for a connection to another mind. Her prose was elegant, her thoughts insightful. She seemed to understand the nature of a hard life without ever complaining. She never spoke of her appearance, and in his mind, he began to form an image of her, a plain, sturdy woman, perhaps, but one with a kind heart and a quick mind. It was more than he had dared to hope for. After 2 months of riding back and forth, he found himself looking forward to the mail wagon with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. One evening, staring into the fire, he made a decision. He took out his entire savings, a small pouch of coins he had been hoarding for a new bull, and sent it to her with a simple note. "This is for the train fare, if you are willing." Elara held the money in her hand, the cold weight of the coins a tangible symbol of her future. She was terrified. She had committed a deception of omission, and the reckoning was coming. But the fear of the unknown was, for the first time, less than the fear of staying. She packed her few belongings into a single, sturdy trunk, her books, a few simple dresses, and a small, worn wooden bird her grandfather had carved for her long ago. Her family bid her farewell with a mixture of relief and disbelief, their pitying glances following her all the way to the station. The journey west was an ordeal. She wore a thick, dark traveling cloak and a hat with a heavy veil, a suffocating costume designed to hide her from the world. The train cars were cramped, the seats too small, her knees constantly bumping against the bench in front of her. She spent the long days staring out the window, watching the landscape transform. The rolling green hills and dense forests of the east gradually gave way to flat, open farmland, which in turn bled into the vast, empty plains of the frontier. The world was opening up, becoming larger, and with every mile that passed, her anxiety grew in equal measure. What would he do when he saw her? Would he send her back on the very next train? The hope that had sustained her for weeks felt fragile now, a tiny flame flickering in a gale of fear. The town of Redemption, Wyoming, was little more than a dusty street with a train depot at one end. When the train hissed to a stop, Elara's heart was hammering against her ribs. She waited until every other passenger had disembarked. Her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles were white. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her cloak around her and stepped down from the train car onto the wooden platform. Jacob was there. He stood near the station master's office, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the immense, empty land. He was just as he had described himself, a man of simple habits, his clothes worn but clean, his face weathered and stoic. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over in a gesture of nervousness that he seemed otherwise incapable of showing. He scanned the few people on the platform, his brow furrowed in confusion. Ilara began to walk towards him, each step an act of will. The platform was only a few dozen yards long, but it felt like a mile. A murmur went through the 2 or 3 men loitering near the depot. They had seen her get off the train. They stopped talking and simply stared. Jacob heard the murmur and turned. He saw the tall, cloaked figure moving towards him. At first, his mind simply registered her as tall, but as she drew closer, the true scale of her became apparent. She was not just tall, she was immense, a towering form that seemed to block out the sun. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The woman in the letters, the woman of gentle humor and quiet strength, could not be this giantess. It was impossible. He felt the blood drain from his face. His feet felt as if they had been nailed to the platform. She came to a stop a few feet in front of him, the heavy veil obscuring her face, the dark cloak hiding her form, but not her staggering height. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the whistling of the wind across the desolate plains. He could not speak. He could not move. He could only stand there, rooted to the spot, staring up at the impossible woman who had come to be his wife. The world had shrunk to the space between them, a few feet of groaning timber on a desolate train platform. Jacob's mind was a maelstrom of colliding thoughts, the elegant prose of her letters and the impossible stature before him, the gentle soul he had come to know on paper and the physical reality that defied all reason. The wind whipped a strand of hair across his face, a minor annoyance that felt monumental, a physical sensation in a moment that was otherwise suspended in disbelief. From behind the thick veil, a voice emerged, soft and uncertain, yet carrying a clear, cultured tone that was achingly familiar. "Mr. Stone, I am Ilara Vance." It was her. It was the voice from the letters. The sound of it broke the paralysis that held him. He swallowed, his throat dry as dust. "Miss Vance," he managed, his own voice a rough croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Welcome to redemption." The words felt hollow, a formal greeting for a situation that was anything but. The station master, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, bustled out of his office, his curiosity having finally overcome his professional decorum. His eyes widened as he took in the scene, his gaze traveling up the full, impossible height of Ilara. He quickly schooled his features into a semblance of neutrality. "Everything all right here, Jacob?" Jacob nodded, grateful for the interruption. "Yes, Henry, we'll just be a moment." He gestured vaguely towards the office. "The lady has had a long journey. Perhaps she might wish to sit for a spell before the ride out to the ranch." It was an excuse, a desperate need to get out of the open, away from the prying eyes of the loiterers who were now staring openly. Inside the cramped, dusty office, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and old paper. Ilara stood near the door, a silent, shrouded statue, while Jacob paced the small space, his boots loud on the floorboards. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a bewildering torrent of other feelings, confusion, a strange sense of betrayal, and something else he could not name. He stopped pacing and faced her, his gaze fixed somewhere around her shoulders, unable to look higher. The veil," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to shield her, to protect her from the naked shock he was sure was written all over his face. You can leave it on for now. For the ride, the dust is something fierce." It was the wrong thing to say. He knew it the instant the words left his mouth. He saw her posture stiffen beneath the heavy cloak. Her silence was no longer uncertain. It was brittle, sharp, with a pain he could not comprehend. When she spoke again, her voice was low and steady, stripped of its earlier softness and forged into something hard and defiant. "No," she said. "You should see who you have agreed to marry." With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached up with both hands and untied the ribbons of her hat. She lifted it off, and with it, the veil. She stood before him, her face finally revealed in the dim light of the office. And Jacob froze. It was not revulsion that stopped his heart. It was not anger or disappointment. The face he looked upon was one of singular kindness. Her features were well proportioned, her mouth gentle, her jawline showing a quiet strength. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were a deep, sorrowful gray, and in their depths, he saw it all. He saw a lifetime of cruel words and curious stares. He saw the 1,000 tiny cuts of being an object of pity, the crushing weight of being a spectacle. He saw a soul that had been relentlessly, systematically taught to be ashamed of the very space it occupied in the world. The initial shock of her height was a shallow thing, a mere curiosity of the flesh. This was different. This was a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy, a soul-deep recognition of a pain so profound it stole the air from his lungs. He was paralyzed by the weight of it, by the sudden, crushing understanding that this woman's entire life had been a battle he could not even begin to imagine. The ride to the ranch was a journey through a landscape of silence. Jacob clucked at the horses, his hands moving through the familiar motions of driving the buckboard wagon on autopilot. His mind was miles away, still back in that dusty office, replaying the look in her eyes. Alara sat beside him, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stared straight ahead at the endless horizon, her face a pale, beautiful mask of misery. The vast, empty plains that Jacob had always found comforting now felt like a physical representation of the gulf between them. Every jolt of the wagon, every cry of a distant hawk, every whisper of the wind through the prairie grass only served to deepen the agonizing tension. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm. But what could he say? "I'm sorry for your pain. I see you." The words felt flimsy and inadequate, insults to the profound sorrow she carried. So he said nothing, and his silence was its own kind of cruelty. He could feel her awareness of him, just as he was acutely aware of her. He could feel the heat from her body, hear the soft rustle of her dress, sense the sheer, solid presence of her on the seat beside him. They were two strangers, bound by a handful of letters and a desperate gamble, now trapped together in an awkwardness so profound it felt like a third passenger in the wagon. The wedding, if one could call it that, took place the following afternoon. A traveling preacher, a gaunt man named Reverend Miller with tired eyes and a threadbare coat, was passing through the area. Jacob had ridden out to intercept him, arranging the grim transaction with a few words and a silver dollar. He had asked his closest neighbor, Jebediah Franklin, to stand as a witness. Jebediah was a decent man, but not a subtle one. When he saw Alara emerge from the cabin, his jaw dropped and he forgot to close it. He spent the entire ceremony staring, his gaze a mixture of awe and morbid fascination. They stood in the main room of the cabin, the air still and heavy. Reverend Miller read the vows from his worn Bible in a hurried monotone, eager to be on his way. Jacob and Alara spoke their responses in low, clear voices, their eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, never looking at each other. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace. There was only another heavy silence, broken by Jebediah clearing his throat and muttering his congratulations before making a hasty retreat, undoubtedly racing home to tell his wife the unbelievable news. The gossip that would engulf the small community of redemption had officially begun. That night was a study in profound and painful awkwardness. They were husband and wife, yet they knew nothing of each other beyond what could be gleaned from ink on paper. The small cabin, once Jacob's solitary refuge, now felt impossibly crowded and suffocatingly intimate. Alara moved with a careful, guarded grace, trying to navigate the low-ceilinged space without constantly stooping, her every movement a reminder that she was not made for this world. Jacob made a simple supper of salt pork and beans. They ate in silence at the small table, the scraping of their forks against the tin plates the only sound. He could not bring himself to meet her eyes, and she did not try to meet his. After the meal, he took a spare blanket from his chest. "You should take the bed," he said, his voice quiet. "I will sleep by the hearth." She looked at him then, a flicker of surprise in her sad, gray eyes. She simply nodded, a small, grateful gesture. "Thank you." He laid his bedroll out on the floor, the familiar hardness a small comfort. He lay there for hours, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Listening, he could hear the soft sounds from the bedroom, the creak of the mattress as she sat down, the rustle of her clothes, the quiet sigh she let out in the darkness. He was a husband again, but the knowledge brought him no comfort. The chasm between the man on the floor and the woman in the bed seemed as wide and as empty as the prairie at midnight. He felt a loneliness so sharp and so complete, it was worse than any he had ever known when he was truly alone. A few days later, their supplies ran low, and a trip into Redemption was unavoidable. Jacob announced it at breakfast. A simple statement of fact. "We need flour and salt. We will go into town this morning." He saw the fear that flashed in her eyes before she could hide it. "I can stay here," she offered, her voice barely a whisper. "You could go alone." "No," he said, his tone firmer than he intended. "You are my wife. You live here. You cannot hide in this cabin forever." It was a cruel thing to say, but it was born of a grim practicality. The town would have to face her eventually. Better to get it over with. The ride into town was a repeat of their first journey, saturated with a silent dread. As they approached the single dusty street that constituted the town, Alara seemed to shrink into herself, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as if it were a suit of armor. Jacob's jaw was set, his hands gripping the reins tightly. Redemption lived up to its name in that it offered no salvation, only judgment. As their wagon rolled down the main street, conversation stopped. Work ceased. Heads turned. People emerged from the doorways of the general store and the saloon to stare. It was not a subtle, sideways glance. It was a brazen, unified gawk. Jacob heard the whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, following them down the street. Mothers instinctively pulled their children behind their skirts, as if Alara were a monster from a storybook. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mercantile. He wanted to tell her to stay in the wagon, to shield her from this, but he knew it would only make things worse. He had to act as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "I will be just a moment," he said, his voice strained. As he was tying off the reins, a man stepped off the boardwalk of the saloon. He was handsome in a predatory way, with dark, confident eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. It was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood owned the largest ranch in the valley and held a long-standing grudge against Jacob over a disputed water rights claim. He saw Jacob struggle and took a perverse pleasure in adding to it. Blackwood sauntered over to the wagon, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. He ignored Jacob completely, his eyes fixed on Alara. He let his gaze travel slowly up her entire length, a deliberately insulting appraisal. Well, Stone," Blackwood said, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "I heard you'd bought yourself some new livestock, but I did not realize you were bringing in a whole new breed." He chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "Where did you find her? Have to special order a giantess like that, I imagine." Jacob felt a cold, white-hot rage rise in his chest. He took a step towards Blackwood, his hands clenching into fists. "That is my wife you are talking about, Silas." Blackwood just laughed, thoroughly enjoying himself. He tipped his hat in Alara's direction, a gesture of pure mockery. "My apologies, ma'am. Welcome to Redemption." He turned back to the crowd that was now openly watching the spectacle. "Looks like Jacob's giantess is going to be the talk of the town for some time to come." The name hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Jacob's giantess. It was a brand, a label that would stick to her forever in this place. Jacob saw the flicker of pain in Alara's eyes. a wound so deep it was visible for just a second before she walled it off, her expression becoming one of stony indifference. She did not look at Blackwood. She did not look at the crowd. She stared at a point far beyond them, as if she had transported herself to a place where their cruel words could not reach. Jacob felt a surge of helpless fury, for himself and for her. He had brought her here. He had brought her to this place of open scorn, and he did not know how to protect her from it. The final blow came not from the cruelty of men, but from the indifference of nature. The weeks that followed their disastrous trip to town were marked by a spell of unusually warm weather, a false spring that coaxed the tender green shoots from the earth in Jacob's vegetable garden. That garden was not a hobby. It was a crucial part of their survival, the food that would see them through the coming year. Elara, to his surprise, had taken to it with a quiet diligence, her long fingers surprisingly gentle as she weeded and watered the fledgling plants. Then, one night, the temperature plummeted. A freak frost descended upon the valley, a silent, glittering thief. When Jacob stepped out of the cabin the next morning, the world was coated in a thin, crystalline layer of ice. His heart sank. He walked to the garden. Every single plant, every hopeful green shoot, was blackened and limp, killed by the biting cold. Months of potential food, gone in a single night. It was a devastating setback, a kick in the teeth from a land that was always finding new ways to break a man. But the town of Redemption found a different reason for the calamity. When Jacob rode in alone a few days later for supplies he could not afford, he heard the talk. It was no longer just gossip. It had curdled into something darker. The frost was unnatural, they said, a bad omen. It had not happened in years. It had only happened. They whispered in the general store and over the bar at the saloon. Since the arrival of that unnatural woman at the Stone Ranch, the land itself, they concluded with superstitious certainty, was rejecting her. She was a curse, and Jacob Stone had brought that curse down upon them all. In the wake of the frost and the town's superstitious scorn, the world of Jacob and Elara shrank to the boundaries of the ranch. Their isolation was now absolute. No neighbors stopped by to pass the time. No riders offered a friendly wave from a distance. They were utterly alone, marooned on an island of dust and silence, with only the vast, indifferent sky as their witness. The daily routine of the ranch, a relentless cycle of hard labor, became their only language, the only bridge across the chasm of awkwardness that separated them. It began in the pre-dawn chill, the scraping of the shovel as Jacob cleared the ashes from the stove, the first sound of the day. He would move to the barn, his footsteps crunching on the cold ground, to milk their lone cow and feed the horses. When he returned, Elara would be up, moving with a quiet efficiency that surprised him. She would have the coffee boiling and a skillet of something sizzling on the stove. They ate their meals in the same tense silence as they always had, but now it was a silence punctuated by the shared knowledge of the work that lay ahead, a common purpose that needed no words. Jacob had expected his new wife to be a creature of the city, ill-suited to the brutal demands of frontier life. He had been wrong. He quickly learned that Elara was not just willing to work. She was immensely capable, a force of nature in her own right. The very attributes that had been the source of her shame back east became astonishing assets on the ranch. One morning, he was struggling to set a new fence post, his shoulder still aching from an old injury, the heavy timber refusing to settle into the hole he had dug. He grunted with effort, his muscles straining, without a word. Elara, who had been mending a section of fence nearby, came over. She gently moved him aside, wrapped her long arms around the post, and lifted it as if it were a child's toy, settling it perfectly into place. She did not look at him for praise. She simply picked up her tools and went back to her own work, leaving Jacob staring, a mixture of gratitude and profound astonishment warring within him. Another day, a young bull, full of temper and brute strength, broke through a gate and was heading for the open plains. Jacob swore, grabbing a rope and preparing for a long, hard ride. But Elara was closer. She did not run at the animal or shout. Instead, she simply walked to intercept it, planting herself in its path. She was taller than the bull, a solid, unmovable obstacle. The animal snorted, pawed the ground, and lowered its head. But it did not charge. It seemed to recognize a strength that matched or even surpassed its own. It hesitated, then allowed itself to be calmly herded back into the corral. She could lift feed sacks that made him grunt, split firewood with a steady, powerful rhythm, and handle the most difficult livestock with a calm that seemed to soothe them. Her long reach allowed her to clear snow from the cabin roof without a ladder, and her large hands could work a stiff leather harness with surprising dexterity. Day by day, Jacob's perception of her began to undergo a subtle but profound transformation. He had married a giantess, a spectacle, a problem. But the woman who worked beside him from sunup to sundown was not a spectacle. She was a partner. As the hard edges of his shock began to soften, he started to truly see her, not just as a worker, but as a person. He would observe her in the quiet moments that fell between the endless chores. He watched from the doorway of the barn as she tended to a calf that had been abandoned by its mother. She knelt in the hay, her huge frame curled around the small, shivering creature, and spoke to it in a low, soft voice, coaxing it to drink milk from her fingers. Her hands, which could tame a bull, were impossibly gentle. In that moment, he saw not her size, but the depth of her compassion. He would come into the cabin after a long day, exhausted and covered in dust, to the warm, comforting smell of fresh bread. With their meager supplies, baking was a luxury. Yet Elara managed it. She had a skill for making something out of almost nothing, for turning their sparse pantry into meals that were not just sustenance, but a small act of grace in their harsh world. He would watch her as she kneaded the dough, her movements sure and practiced, her face softened by concentration. He began to see the woman from the letters, the intelligent, thoughtful person who had captivated him with her words. Sometimes, at sunset, he would see her standing on the porch, staring out at the distant mountains as they turned purple in the fading light. Her hands would rest on the railing, and her face would hold an expression of such profound, quiet longing that it made his own heart ache. He realized she was as much a prisoner of this land as he was, and her loneliness was a mirror of his own. The label Silas Blackwood had branded her with, Jacob's giantess, began to fade from his mind. In its place, a single name began to form, quietly and simply, Elara. The first crack in his emotional armor came on a blistering afternoon in late spring. He was in the far corral, trying to break a wild colt he had bought cheap, a fiery young Mustang with malice in its eyes. The animal was all muscle and fury, fighting the rope with a savage intensity. Jacob, his mind distracted by the ever-present worries of their dwindling funds and social isolation, made a mistake. He let the rope go slack for just a second, and it was all the opening the colt needed. It bucked violently, a twisting, brutal motion that sent Jacob flying through the air. He landed hard on his right side, a sickening crack echoing from his shoulder as a bolt of white-hot pain shot through him. He lay in the dust, gasping for breath, the world a dizzying blur of pain. The colt, now free, galloped wildly around the corral, its eyes rolling. Through the haze, he saw Elara running from the cabin. He expected her to scream, to panic. She did neither. Her face was a mask of calm focus. She did not immediately rush to his side. Instead, she entered the corral and walked steadily towards the frenzied animal. She did not carry a rope or a stick. She simply walked, her great height and unhurried pace a calming presence in the chaos. She spoke to the colt in the same low, soothing voice she used with the calf, and she slowly, patiently, herded it into a corner of the corral, where it stood, sides heaving, its wildness momentarily subdued by her quiet authority. Only then did she come to him. She knelt in the dust, her shadow falling over him. "Do not move," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Her fingers probed his shoulder with an expert touch. He winced, a sharp cry escaping his lips. "It is out of place," she said simply. "I must put it back." He gritted his teeth, preparing for the agony. "Do it!" She positioned herself, placing one hand on his chest and the other on his upper arm. "Breathe out," she commanded. As he exhaled, she pulled and twisted with a swift, powerful motion. There was a sickening pop, and the searing pain was replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. He slumped back, sweat beading on his forehead. The physical closeness was unnerving. He was acutely aware of her proximity, of the strength in her hands, of the concern in her gray eyes, which for the first time were not filled with sadness, but with a fierce competence. She helped him to his feet, her arm supporting him, and half carried him back to the cabin. She tore a strip from a clean sheet to make a sling and packed his shoulder with a cold, wet cloth. Her touch was sure and impersonal, the touch of a healer. Yet it was the most intimate contact they had ever shared. As she worked, a strange and unfamiliar feeling bloomed in his chest. It was gratitude, yes, but it was more than that. It was a profound, humbling respect. The wall he had built around his heart, the wall of grief and loneliness and shock, had just sustained its first real crack. While a fragile, unspoken truce began to form within the cabin walls, the world outside grew ever more hostile. Silas Blackwood was not a man to let a grudge die. Seeing that Jacob and his strange wife had not yet been broken, he escalated his campaign against them. The rumors he spread took on a sharper, more dangerous edge. He began telling people that Jacob's cattle were sickly, that they carried a fever that could wipe out a whole herd. It was a lie, but in a community already primed by superstition, it was a believable one. Men who had once been his neighbors now steered their herds clear of his land, and the brand of the Stone Ranch became a mark of poison. The final blow to their economic hopes came in early summer. A large section of federal grazing land was coming up for lease, a rich pasture that could have saved Jacob's dwindling herd. He rode into Redemption to submit his bid to the town council, which managed the process. He walked into the meeting room to find the 3 council members seated at a table, with Silas Blackwood leaning against the wall behind them, a confident smirk on his face. Jacob submitted his bid, which was fair and honest. The council barely looked at it. The chairman, a man named Peters who was deep in Blackwood's pocket, cleared his throat and announced that, due to concerns about the health of Jacob's livestock and his general standing in the community, his bid was rejected. The lease was awarded to Silas. Jacob stood there, his one good arm hanging uselessly at his side, the public humiliation washing over him. He was being systematically dismantled, his livelihood stripped away piece by piece. He turned and walked out of the room without a word, the sound of Blackwood's soft laughter following him out into the dusty street. The message was clear. They were not welcome here. They were being erased. Tragedy, when it came, did not arrive with the slow cruelty of men, but with the swift, terrifying fury of the prairie itself. It was a hot, dry evening in late August. A relentless wind had been blowing from the south for 3 days, rattling the windows of the cabin and carrying the scent of dust and distant thunder. Jacob stood on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was a strange, bruised orange, and a dark haze was building on the southern horizon. A primal unease settled in his gut. He had seen skies like that before. The smell came first, a faint, acrid scent of smoke on the wind. Then, as darkness fell, they saw it, a low, angry red glow that pulsed against the horizon like a dying heartbeat, a prairie fire, and it was moving fast, driven by the relentless wind, straight towards them. There was no time for discussion, no time for fear. There was only time for action. Survival was a pure, primal instinct that stripped away everything else. "The well!" Jacob shouted over the rising roar of the wind. "Bring every bucket we have." What followed was a desperate, chaotic battle against a merciless enemy. The fire swept across the plains with the speed of a galloping horse, a roaring wall of flame that devoured everything in its path. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. The heat was a physical blow, so intense it felt like it was cooking the very air they breathed. They worked side by side in the hellish, flickering light, a synchronized team united by a single, overwhelming purpose. Jacob, his shoulder still aching, used his good arm to dig a desperate firebreak, a shallow trench in the dry earth around the cabin and barn. Ilara, her face grim and smudged with soot, worked with a tireless ferocity. She soaked horse blankets and heavy sacks in the water trough and used them to beat back the greedy tongues of flame that leaped across the trench. Her long reach and incredible strength were their greatest weapons. She could smother a patch of burning grass that would have been out of his reach, could swing a heavy, waterlogged blanket with the force of a battering ram. They did not speak. There was no need. A shouted word, a pointed finger, a shared glance of grim understanding was all the communication they needed. They were no longer Jacob and Ilara, the lonely rancher and his giantess wife. They were two human beings fighting for their lives against an elemental rage. Hours bled into one another. Their muscles screamed in protest. Their lungs burned. Their skin was scorched by flying embers. They fought until exhaustion became a dull, constant ache, until their movements were purely mechanical, driven by sheer will alone. The fire encircled them, trapping them on their small island of frantically defended land. The barn caught fire once, a stray ember landing on the dry roof. Without a moment's hesitation, Ilara scrambled onto the corral fence, hoisted herself up, and smothered the flames with a wet sack. Her own dress singed in the process. She worked with a desperate, focused courage that left Jacob breathless. Just before dawn, when they were at the absolute end of their strength and hope was beginning to fail, the wind shifted. As if by a miracle, it turned back on itself, pushing the main wall of fire away from them. Eastward, across the plains. The immediate threat was over. They stood together in the eerie gray light of the false dawn, two soot-blackened figures in a world of ruin. The landscape around them was a smoking, blackened desert. The air was thick with the smell of ash and defeat. Much of their grazing land was gone, turned to cinder, but the cabin was standing. The barn was scarred but intact, and in the corral, their few remaining animals huddled together, safe. They had survived. Jacob looked at Ilara. Her hair was matted with sweat and ash. Her face was a mask of grime, and there were small burns on her arms. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. The unspoken bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the disaster was a palpable thing, as real and as powerful as the fire itself. They had faced the apocalypse together, and they had won. In the midst of the devastation, they stood not as strangers, but as partners, their shared survival a testament to a strength they had not known they possessed. The sun rose on a dead world, where yesterday there had been a sea of sun-bleached prairie grass. There was now only a black, barren wasteland stretching to the horizon. The earth was a uniform of ash and charcoal, scarred and smoking in the pale morning light. The wind, which had been their enemy, was now a mournful friend, whispering through the skeletal remains of sagebrush and carrying the thick, cloying smell of smoke that clung to everything, their clothes, their hair, their very lungs. Hope, a fragile seedling they had barely begun to nurture, had been burned to the root. Their grazing land was gone. Their small vegetable garden was a patch of black dust. The town of redemption, they both knew without saying it, would offer no help. In the twisted logic of fear and superstition, this fire was not a natural disaster. It was a judgment. It was proof of the curse they believed Ilara had brought with her. They were pariahs, and their misfortune was seen as a righteous punishment from God and the land itself. For 2 days, they moved like automatons through the ruin. They patched the scorched roof of the barn. their movements slow and heavy with an exhaustion that was bone-deep. They rationed the last of their flour and smoked meat, the meager portions a stark reminder of their dwindling resources. They spoke only when necessary, their words short and practical, clipped sounds in the overwhelming silence of the devastation. The shared, desperate energy of the fight had dissipated, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. They had survived the fire, but they were not sure if they would survive the peace. On the third night, the emptiness became unbearable. They sat at the small table in the cabin, a single oil lamp casting a weak, flickering glow against the darkness. The smell of smoke was a permanent resident now, a ghost of the disaster they had endured. Outside, the wind moaned a low, ceaseless dirge. Jacob stared at his hands, lying useless on the tabletop. He felt a familiar despair creeping back in, the same cold, heavy blanket that had almost smothered him before Ilara's arrival. He had lost everything once before. Now, it seemed, he was destined to lose it all again. It was Ilara who broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, raspy from smoke and disuse. "This is my fault." It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, a weary acceptance of the role the world had assigned her. Jacob looked up, truly looking at her for the first time in days. He saw the grime on her face, the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, and the profound, bottomless guilt in her gray eyes. "No," he said, his own voice rough. "It was the wind and a dry spell. Nothing more." "They do not think so," she whispered, her gaze falling to her own hands, which were clasped so tightly together the knuckles were white. "The town, they think I am a bad omen. The frost, and now this. Perhaps they are right. Everywhere I go, trouble seems to follow." A dam of silence that had stood between them for months began to crack. Jacob found himself speaking, the words coming from a place of deep, buried pain he rarely visited. "Trouble does not need a reason. Miss Vance, Ilara, it just is." He took a shaky breath, the confession of a lifetime sitting on his tongue. "I had a wife before, Sarah, and a son, Thomas. He was 4 years old." Ilara looked up, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten in the face of his. She did not speak, but her eyes held a question, an invitation to continue. "He had a laugh that could make you forget a whole day of hard work," Jacob said, his voice growing thick. "And Sarah, she had a way of humming when she was content. The whole cabin used to feel warm, even in the dead of winter." He stared at the flickering flame of the lamp, seeing other images in its light. "Then the cholera came. It was so fast. One day, Thomas was chasing grasshoppers in the yard. A week later, I was digging their graves, by myself, on that hill out back." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a grief that was as fresh as if it were yesterday. "I have asked myself every day for 5 years what I could have done different. Should I have seen the sickness sooner? Should we have left the territory? I carry it with me, every moment. The silence in this cabin. It is not just emptiness. It is the sound of them not being here. It is the sound of my failure." The last word was a choked whisper. Ilara listened, her face a canvas of empathy. The stoic, hard man she had known only through his work was gone, replaced by a husband mourning his lost world. When he finished, she did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She simply offered him the truth of her own brokenness, a gift of shared pain. "I have never known a love like that to lose," she began, her voice a low murmur. "My life has been a different kind of quiet, a different kind of failure." She looked down at her large hands, the source of so much strength and so much shame. "From the time I was a little girl, I was a curiosity, a spectacle. Other girls were whispered about for their beauty or their wit. I was whispered about for my size. At church socials, the boys would dare each other to ask me to dance, just to see the joke of it up close. My own family, they loved me, I believe, but they did not know what to do with me. I was a problem to be solved, a constant source of embarrassment. She told him of the low doorways, the dresses that never fit, the constant draining effort of trying to make herself smaller, to take up less space in a world that resented the very air she breathed. I spent so many years locked in my room with books, pretending that the worlds on the page were enough, but they were not. I would lie awake at night and I would dream of being average, of walking down a street and having no one notice me at all. What a luxury that would be. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. When I saw your advertisement, it was a lifeline, a chance to go somewhere no one knew me, somewhere my size might not matter as much. But I was a coward. I did not tell you the truth in my letters. I let you create a picture of a woman who did not exist. And when I stepped off that train, and I saw the look on your face, her voice broke. I saw the same look I have seen my entire life, disappointment, revulsion, and I knew I had failed again. She finally looked up at him, tears tracking clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. My deepest fear, Mr. Stone, is not being alone. It is the fear that I am, by my very nature, unlovable. The cabin was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of 2 lifetimes of pain, 2 souls laid bare. The space between them was no longer a chasm of awkwardness, but a sacred ground of shared vulnerability. The man who had lost his world and the woman who had never been allowed to have one looked at each other, and for the first time, they truly saw. Jacob felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement of the heart, all the pent-up loneliness, the grudging respect that had grown into a quiet admiration, the overwhelming empathy he had felt in the station master's office. It all coalesced into a single, powerful, and undeniable emotion. It was love, a raw, fierce love forged in the crucible of tragedy. He reached across the small table, his calloused, trembling hand covering hers. Her skin was cool, her hand strong and capable, and it fit in his as if it belonged there. "Ilara," he said, his voice husky. "When you took off that veil, I did not freeze because of what I saw. I froze because of what I felt. I saw a lifetime of hurt in your eyes, and it stopped my heart." He stood up and walked around the table to her. She watched him, her eyes wide and uncertain. He knelt before her, so that their faces were on the same level. He was a man of the earth. Not of words, but he spoke the truest words he knew. "I have never known anyone as strong as you," he said, his voice low and intense. "You fought a fire to save this home. You faced down cruelty with a grace I cannot imagine. The people in this town, they see your height. They see a giantess." He gently raised his hand and cupped her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. "When I look at you, I see the woman who brings a dying calf back to life. I see the woman who bakes bread from nothing. I see the woman whose spirit is bigger and stronger than this whole, damn, empty territory." He traced the lines around her eyes, the paths her tears had made. "They are the blind ones. Ilara, not me." A sob escaped her lips, a sound of such profound release it was as if a great weight had been lifted from her soul. He leaned in and gently, reverently, pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance. It was a promise. "You are seen, you are known, you are home." Later, in the quiet darkness of the small bedroom, they came together. The world outside was a blackened ruin, a hostile place filled with judgment and hate. But inside the walls of the cabin, they created a sanctuary. For Jacob, it was the end of 5 years of desolate, haunted sleep. To hold another person, to feel the warmth of a living, breathing body next to his, was to finally feel the thaw of a long and bitter winter in his soul. For Ilara, it was the ultimate act of acceptance, a confirmation that she was not a spectacle, but a woman worthy of love and desire, to be touched not with curiosity, but with a tenderness that bordered on worship, was to heal a lifetime of wounds. It was a quiet, deeply moving union, an emotional consummation more than a physical one. Two outcasts, two lonely souls who had been defined by what they had lost and what they had never had, found a home in each other, in the shelter of each other's arms. They were no longer the grieving widower and the lonely giantess. They were simply Jacob and Alara, and in that small, quiet room, surrounded by the ghosts of a fire, they found a love powerful enough to stand against the world. The next morning, they awoke to the same dead landscape, but everything had changed. A quiet determination had settled over them, a calm strength born of their newfound unity. They stood on the porch, sipping coffee, looking out at the devastation. The smell of smoke was still there, but it no longer smelled of defeat. It smelled of a trial they had passed together. "There is not much left," Alara said, her voice soft. She leaned against his side, and he wrapped his good arm around her shoulders. It felt natural. Right. "No," Jacob agreed. "But we are still here. The cabin is still here. The well is still full." He looked out at the blackened earth, but his eyes were seeing something else, the future. "My father used to say that after a fire, the land comes back stronger. The ash gives it new life." He turned to look at her, his gaze steady and clear. "We will rebuild, Alara." She looked up at him, a small, hopeful smile gracing her lips for the first time since she had arrived in this harsh land. "Together," she said. It was a pact, a simple and unbreakable promise made in the heart of the ruins. They were no longer just partners in survival, two people thrown together by desperation. They were a team, a family, united by a love that had been forged in the very flames that had threatened to destroy them. The world was still against them, but for the first time, they were ready to fight back. Love, Jacob discovered, did not mend the world. It did not restore the burned grass or fill their empty pantry. What it did was change the way one looked at the ruins. He and Alara would walk the blackened fields, not with despair, but with a quiet sense of purpose. The devastation was no longer an end point. It was a starting line. Their life together would begin here, in the ashes. One morning, while surveying a section of land near a scorched creek bed, a memory surfaced in Jacob's mind, a piece of his father's wisdom he had long forgotten. "Water is shy," his father used to say, "but willows are shameless gossips. They always tell you where it is hiding." He looked around. The fire had taken most of the vegetation, but near the creek, a cluster of young willow shoots, miraculously spared, were pushing up through the blackened soil, their leaves a vibrant, defiant green. "Alara," he said, a new excitement in his voice. "Bring a shovel." Together, they dug. The work was hard, the ground baked solid by the fire's heat. But they worked as a unit, their movements in sync. He would break the hard crust of the earth, and she would clear the loose soil with a single, powerful scoop of the shovel. An hour passed, then two. Sweat poured down their faces, but they did not stop. And then, Jacob's shovel hit something different. Not the dull thud of rock, but a wet, sucking sound. He dug his hands into the hole and felt it, cool, damp earth. A few inches deeper, and water, clear and clean, began to seep into the bottom of the hole. It was not a gush, but a steady, reliable welling up from the deep, a hidden pulse of life that the fire had not been able to touch. They knelt by the edge of the small, muddy pool, watching the water rise. It felt like a miracle, a benediction from the land itself. In a world that had given them only hardship, here was a gift. It was a new, reliable source of water, closer to the cabin than the old well, a practical treasure beyond measure. But it was more than that. It was a sign, a promise that life persists, that even in the deepest desolation, there is a hidden spring of hope waiting to be found. Jacob looked at Alara, her face streaked with mud and sweat, and he smiled, a true, unburdened smile. She smiled back, and in that shared look, they felt the first solid foundation of their future settle into place. The discovery of the spring seemed to uncork something within Alara as well. The change was subtle at first, then undeniable. The love she shared with Jacob. A love that was not given in spite of her height but in full acceptance of it, had begun to dissolve a lifetime of shame. She started to carry herself differently. The slight stoop that had been her unconscious apology for existing was gone. She stood tall, her posture straight and confident, as if she were finally claiming the space she occupied. Her movements, once so careful and guarded, became fluid and assured. She was no longer a woman hiding in a giant's body. She was simply Alara. And Alara was a tall, strong woman. Her new confidence was a quiet thing, but it radiated from her. When she spoke, her voice was firmer. When she met Jacob's gaze, it was without the shadow of fear that had always lurked in her eyes. This newfound self-worth was a revelation to them both. He saw the beautiful, resilient woman he had fallen in love with finally see herself in the same light, and she, looking at the world through his eyes of love and admiration, began to believe that she was not a curse, but a blessing. Their isolation was broken by the most unexpected of visitors. One afternoon, a rickety farm wagon made its way slowly up the path to their cabin. Jacob, instantly wary, reached for the rifle he kept by the door. On the wagon sat a family, a man, a woman, and two small, tow-headed children. As they drew closer, he recognized them as the Schmidts, a family of German immigrants who had a small, struggling homestead a few miles to the north. They were outsiders, just like Jacob and Alara, their broken English and foreign ways keeping them at a distance from the suspicious community of redemption. The man, Klaus Schmidt, pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He was a stocky man with kind, worried eyes, and he held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim nervously. His wife, Maria, remained on the wagon, holding her children close. "Mr. Stone," Klaus began, his accent thick. "We hear the fire. We see the smoke. We are sorry for your trouble." Jacob nodded, his hand still resting on the rifle. "We are managing Mr. Schmidt." Klaus gestured to the back of the wagon. "We do not have much. The town, it is not so friendly to us, but we have seed for a late garden. Corn, beans. It is not much, but perhaps it is something." He then pointed to some fresh-cut lumber in the wagon bed. "And I see your barn. The roof is burned. I am a fair carpenter. My wife, she brings you bread." Jacob and Alara stood on the porch, stunned into silence by this simple, unexpected act of kindness. In a world that had shown them only scorn, here was a hand of friendship, extended by fellow outcasts who understood what it meant to be on the outside looking in. The lump in Jacob's throat was so thick he could not speak. It was Alara who stepped forward, a warm, genuine smile on her face. "Thank you, Mr. Schmidt," she said, her voice clear and welcoming. "We would be very grateful." For the next week, they worked together. Klaus Schmidt was indeed a fine carpenter, and with Jacob and Alara's help, the burned section of the barn roof was repaired, stronger than before. Maria Schmidt brought them food and shared her seeds, her initial shyness giving way to a quiet friendship with Alara. The two women would talk while they worked in the garden, planting the new seeds in the rich, ash-fertilized soil near the spring. For the first time, Alara had a friend. For the first time, the silence of the ranch was broken by the sound of children's laughter. This small, fragile alliance was a powerful counterpoint to the town's prejudice, a testament to the fact that community was not about proximity, but about shared humanity. But while hope was being rebuilt on the Stone Ranch, rage was festering in the heart of Silas Blackwood. He had expected the fire to be the final straw. He had expected to ride by their property and find it abandoned, its owners broken and driven out. Instead, he saw smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. He saw a new roof on the barn. He saw, through his spyglass, The tall, strange woman working in a new garden, and the hated German immigrants helping them. They were not just surviving, they were rebuilding. They were defying him. His hatred, already a potent poison, intensified into a murderous fury. If nature could not break them, he would do it himself. His final move was one of cold, calculated evil. Late one night, he and 2 of his hired hands rode to a secluded corner of his own vast herd. They cut out 5 young steers, roping them and dragging them into a hidden coulee. There, by the light of a single lantern, they heated a branding iron. It was not Blackwood's own brand, the Sprawling Bee, but a crude, Simple's, Jacob Stone's mark, one by one. They pressed the searing iron onto the terrified animals' hides, burning the new brand directly over Blackwood's own. It was a messy, ugly job, but it was good enough for his purpose. The next afternoon, Blackwood rode into redemption, not as a wealthy rancher, but as a victim. He dragged one of the altered steers behind him, its hide a raw, weeping wound. He stormed into the saloon, where the usual collection of ranchers and layabouts were nursing their drinks. "I have been robbed," he bellowed, his voice a performance of righteous anger. "Jacob Stone, that thieving coward, has been rustling my cattle." He laid out his fabricated story. He had found the steer wandering near Stone's property. He showed them the brand. The uglies burned over his own mark. "He is a desperate man," Blackwood spat. "And his giantess wife has addled his mind with her unnatural ways. The fire was a judgment on them, and now he seeks to ruin the rest of us to save his own skin." He played on their fears, their superstitions, their resentment. He spoke of the curse Ilara had brought upon the valley, of the diseased cattle, of the threat a man like Jacob posed to their very way of life. The men in the saloon, their minds already poisoned against the Stones and their judgment clouded by whiskey, listened with growing anger. Blackwood bought a round of drinks, then another. Fear turned to rage, and rage, fueled by alcohol, turned to a dark and violent purpose. A man shouted, "Let us go get him!" Another yelled, "A rope is what he needs!" The frenzy grew, a fire fanned by Blackwood's hateful words. The men poured out of the saloon, their numbers swelling as others joined, drawn by the commotion. They grabbed torches from their brackets, the flames casting a hellish glow on their contorted faces. A rope was produced. They were no longer individuals. They were a single entity, a drunken, torch-wielding lynch mob. And Silas Blackwood was its malevolent brain. The first sign of trouble at the ranch was a low rumble on the horizon, a sound that was not thunder. Jacob and Ilara were on the porch, enjoying the cool of the evening, when they saw the flickering lights in the distance. The lights grew brighter, the rumble louder, resolving itself into the sound of angry voices and the thud of horse hooves. Jacob's face hardened. He stood up, his hand instinctively going to the rifle resting against the wall. "Ilara, get inside. Lock the door. Go to the root cellar if you have to." "No," she said, her voice low and steady. She stood beside him, her height a formidable presence in the deepening twilight. "I will not hide." The mob spilled into their yard, a terrifying wave of hatred and firelight. They surrounded the small cabin, their faces a gallery of grimacing masks in the flickering torchlight. At the forefront was Silas Blackwood, a length of rope coiled in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Stone," he roared, "your time is up. We know you are a thief. We have come to deliver the people's justice." Jacob stepped forward to the edge of the porch, the rifle held loosely in his one good arm. He did not raise it. He stood his ground, his heart pounding but his resolve absolute. He would die here, on this porch, before he let them touch his wife. "There has been no theft," he said, his voice ringing out with a cold calm he did not feel. "You are being lied to by a man who has hated me for years. Go home, all of you." "Liar!" someone screamed. The mob surged, a restless, dangerous tide. They were past reasoning with. just as the first man put his foot on the porch steps. The cabin door opened wide. Alara stepped out into the full glare of the torches. She did not cower or plead. She emerged to her full, imposing height, her silhouette framed by the moonlight, a figure of impossible scale and silent power. The mob faltered, a collective gasp rippling through their ranks. The sheer, unexpected sight of her stunned them into a momentary silence. She did not shout. When she spoke, her voice was clear and powerful, carrying with an unnatural calm over the heads of the angry men. You came here to hang a man based on the word of a liar and the sight of a single, tortured animal. She looked from face to face, her gaze seeming to pick out each individual. I ask you to use your reason. My husband has one good arm. How could a man in his condition rustle 5 steers? And the brand you saw? Think on it. A rustler would blot out the old brand, make it unreadable. He would not be so foolish as to burn a fresh mark right over the top of it for all to see. That is not the work of a thief. That is the work of a man trying to frame another. Her logic was a splash of cold water on their drunken fury. Murmurs of doubt began to spread through the crowd. Blackwood, seeing his control slipping, grew desperate. Do not listen to the witch. She will ensnare you with her words. At that moment, a man near the front, clumsy with drink, stumbled. His torch flew from his hand, a fiery arc through the night air. It landed squarely on the newly repaired roof of the barn. The dry, fresh-cut timber caught instantly, flames licking up into the night sky. A collective cry of alarm went up from the mob. Men backed away, their lust for a hanging forgotten in the face of a real and immediate danger. The barn, with their precious few animals inside, was going to burn. But Alara did not hesitate. While others stared in horror, she moved with a stunning, decisive speed. She leaped from the porch and grabbed the heavy horse blanket that had been airing on the railing. In a single, fluid motion, she plunged it into the full water trough, then pulled the soaking, heavy mass out as if it weighed nothing. She ran to the side of the barn, and with a strength that seemed superhuman, she used her incredible reach to fling the wet blanket up and onto the burning roof. It landed with a great, sizzling slap, smothering the flames in an instant. She stood there, her chest heaving, the smoking blanket still in her hand, her tall form silhouetted against the moon. The yard was plunged into an absolute, profound silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the torches and the terrified whimpering of the animals in the barn. The mob stared, their mouths agape, their minds reeling. They had come to destroy a monster. Instead, they had watched a woman of impossible size and strength perform an act of breathtaking heroism, saving the very property they had come to defile. In that moment, illuminated by the dying firelight, she was not a freak. She was not a curse. She was a savior. The silence that fell over the yard was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence born of shock, of shame, and of a sudden, jarring recalibration of reality. The men of the mob, who minutes before had been a single, roaring beast, were now just a collection of individuals, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning guilt. They looked from the smoking patch on the barn roof to the towering woman who had saved it, to the furious, sputtering face of Silas Blackwood. The world had been turned upside down, and they no longer knew which way was up. Into this void of uncertainty, a voice spoke, hesitant at first but clear in the still night air. It was Klaus Schmidt, the German immigrant, who had followed the mob from a distance, fearing the worst. He stepped forward from the shadows, his wife Maria a few paces behind him, her face pale with worry. He speaks a lie, Klaus said, his voice gaining strength as all eyes turned to him. He pointed a trembling but resolute finger at Blackwood. Silas Blackwood is the liar. Blackwood rounded on him. You stay out of this, you foreigner. This is town business. This is the business of the truth, Klaus insisted, standing his ground. I was with Mr. Stone this afternoon. My son and we helped him mend the fence line on his northern pasture. He was with us from noon until the sun was low. He was nowhere near your herd. Blackwood, he could not have been. An alibi, a simple, verifiable fact that cut through the hysteria like a knife. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The sheriff, a man named Brody, who was more of a politician than a lawman, had been reluctantly carried along by the mob's fervor. Now, seeing the tide turn, he saw his chance to restore order and his own authority. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Is this true, Klaus?" Sheriff Brody asked, his voice now carrying the weight of the law. "It is true," Klaus said firmly. "And as Frau Stone said, look at the brand. It is a fool's brand, a liar's brand. It is made to be seen, to cause this trouble." The fervor of the mob was completely broken now, the whiskey-fueled rage dissolving into a fog of confusion and embarrassment. The men began to look at each other, then at the ground, their torches suddenly feeling heavy and foolish in their hands. They had been played for fools, their worst instincts manipulated by a hateful man for his own petty revenge. Blackwood saw it was over. His face, once triumphant, was now a mask of pure, cornered fury. "You will believe this immigrant over me? You will believe this giantess?" he spat, his voice cracking. Sheriff Brody had heard enough. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking a sharp, definitive sound in the night. "That is enough. Silas, you have caused enough trouble for one night. You are under arrest for inciting this mob and for bearing false witness against your neighbor." Blackwood's rage boiled over. With a wild cry, he lunged not at the sheriff, but at Jacob, his hands clawing like talons. But he never reached him. A great shadow fell over him, and a firm, strong hand clamped down on his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. Ilara stood over him, her expression not angry, but filled with a calm, immense disappointment. Her grip was like iron. Blackwood struggled for a moment, then sagged in defeat, held fast by the very woman he had sought to destroy. Justice, for once in redemption, had prevailed. The dispersal of the mob was a slow, shameful affair. One by one, the men extinguished their torches in the dirt and began the long walk or ride home, their heads bowed. They did not look at Jacob or Ilara. They could not bear to meet the eyes of the people they had been so eager to condemn. The yard slowly emptied, until all that was left was the lingering smell of smoke in the vast, silent Wyoming night. Jacob, Ilara, and the Schmidts stood in the quiet aftermath. Klaus Schmidt simply nodded, a gesture of profound solidarity that needed no words. "We will see you in the morning, friends," he said, and led his family away. Finally, Jacob and Ilara were alone. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the ordeal drained away, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. The moon shone down on their small ranch, on the scarred but standing barn, on the two of them, exhausted but victorious. Jacob walked to her. He gently took the heavy, smoking blanket from her grasp and let it fall to the ground. He looked into her eyes, and in their gray depths, he saw not a savior or a giantess, but his wife, his partner, his entire world. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her shoulder. She wrapped her own arms around him, holding him tightly. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures in the moonlight, holding each other up. They had faced down the fire. They had faced down the hatred of an entire town, and they were still standing. Their love, born in desperation and forged in tragedy, was the only thing that mattered. It was their home, their fortress, their victory. The healing began the next day. It was a slow process, like the first green shoots pushing their way through the ash-covered soil. The town's attitude did not change overnight. There was no grand apology, no collective act of contrition, but the open hostility was gone, replaced by something else, a grudging, astonished respect. When Jacob next rode into town for supplies, the silence that greeted him was different. It was not the silence of shunning, but of awkward reverence. Men who had once turned their backs now met his gaze and gave a short, hesitant nod of acknowledgement. At the Mercantile, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave him a small discount on his order. "For the trouble," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on a sack of flour. Ilara's next trip to town was the true test. She walked down the main street, and people still stopped to look. They would always look. But the nature of their stares had changed. The whispers were no longer cruel. The looks of pity were gone. Now, they looked at her with a kind of awe. She was no longer just a spectacle of nature. She was a woman of substance, a person of known courage. The story of that night had already begun to grow into a local legend, passed from person to person, embellished with each telling. The tale of the giantess of redemption who had faced down a lynch mob with logic and saved her home with her bare hands was becoming a part of the town's folklore. She was still an outsider, but she was their outsider now, a figure of strength to be respected, not a freak to be feared. Years passed. The spring that Jacob had found proved to be a lifeblood. It watered their gardens and their livestock, turning the once scorched land into a green and prosperous oasis. The Stone Ranch, which had been on the verge of collapse, was now thriving. The herd grew, fat and healthy. The small cabin was expanded. A new room added to one side. The porch widened to accommodate a growing family. The laughter of the Schmidt children was often heard in the yard, their friendship a constant, steady anchor in their lives. Jacob and Ilara had not just built a ranch. They had built a true home. They had 2 children of their own. Their son, whom they named Thomas, was a quiet, thoughtful boy with his father's steady gaze and a deep love for the land. He would spend hours following Jacob, learning the rhythms of the ranch, his small hands eager to help. Their daughter, Sarah, was born 2 years later. From the moment she could stand, it was clear she had her mother's frame. She was a tall, strong-willed child with Ilara's kind, gray eyes and a spirit as vast and as untamed as the Wyoming sky. She was fearless, and she carried her height not as a burden, but as a birthright. One cool evening in late summer, Jacob and Ilara sat on their porch swing, a gentle rhythm carrying them back and forth. They were older now. The sun and the hard work had etched lines of character onto their faces, and streaks of silver threaded through Jacob's hair. The sounds of their children playing in the yard, their happy shrieks echoing in the twilight, were the sweet, constant music of their lives. The scent of Ilara's baking bread drifted from the open kitchen window. It was a scene of such perfect, simple peace that it almost made Jacob's heart ache. He held her hand, his thumb tracing the strong, capable lines of her fingers. He looked at her as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, the light catching the silver in her hair and illuminating her face with a soft, warm glow. He looked at her with the same sense of awe he had felt that very first day at the desolate train depot. But the shock was long gone. The fear and confusion had vanished. All that remained was a love so deep and so abiding it felt as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He remembered the towering, veiled woman who had seemed so alien, so impossibly out of place. He remembered the profound sadness in her eyes when she had revealed her face, a look that had broken his heart before he even knew he loved her. Now, he looked at that same face and saw only the beautiful, resilient woman who had fought fires, both real and metaphorical, to stand beside him. He saw the loving mother of his children, the brilliant partner who had helped him turn ashes into an Eden, the anchor of his soul. "What are you thinking about?" Ilara asked, her voice the same soft, gentle sound that had first captivated him in her letters. He smiled, a slow, easy smile of pure contentment. "I was just thinking," he said, squeezing her hand, "that I am a lucky man." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence. watching the last of the sun's light bleed from the sky as the first stars began to appear. They had survived the worst the world and the Wild West could throw at them. They had endured prejudice, hatred, poverty, and disaster. And through it all, they had found each other. Their love was their testament, a quiet, unshakable proof that a home was not a cabin, or a piece of land, or a place on a map. A home was a person. It was the sanctuary two lonely souls could build together, a fortress of love strong enough to keep out the entire world. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with each other. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.